Okay, we're just going to get started here. My name is Zach Samar. I serve as the National Director for Immigrant Connection, and this is a welcome call that we put on. Immigrant Connection focuses on providing church-based immigration legal services in under-resourced communities. We also realize that many churches are somewhere along the welcome journey of learning, connecting, and welcoming with immigrants in their community. And so the welcome call is just a way to resource you and kind of help spur on conversations and connections. And the more that you can be always in the process of learning more about immigrants and refugees and ways to welcome them, ways to empower and advocate and do ministry to, with, and through them is always a win on our part. And so as we were putting together this schedule for the year a few months ago, refugees have been in the news for a very long time, and they are still in the news. And so whether it's things like the refugee cap, which we thought this new administration was going to, change, and then they wavered, and then they didn't do what they were wanted, and there was advocacy. Whether it's the fact that we know that worldwide the number of refugees continues to go up, and we have more refugees in the world today than ever before. Right now is also a unique thing that we'll talk about today, that refugee resettlement agencies, because of the previous administration, all had to cut a lot of their programs and their staff. And now the reality is like, how do you ramp back up? Like, how do you get the spigot turned back on? And how can churches help with that? What are ways forward when it comes to, volunteering or partnering together? And so refugees are really, really important. As an organization that serves immigrants in general, and refugees are one category, the reality is that, in my own opinion, while there could be lots of debates about lots of things, there should never be debates about refugees. However, more and more, even in the local church, it seems like we have to convince the church that they are called to love and welcome refugees as well. And the hope is that this call will allow you to understand that this is God's heart. And out of almost every group, this is a group that we should be caring for, loving for, and partnering with. And so I am not the expert. And so I asked some of my friends who are experts. World Relief is one of the refugee resettlement agencies. We'll kind of talk more about that. There's not many refugee resettlement agencies in the whole country. And so World Relief is one of just a handful that get to do this work. And so they're with us today, and all I'm going to do is ask some questions. If you're on the call and you have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A or the chat, and we'll make sure that practitioners that actually know what they're doing can jump on. And so if either one of you want to start and introduce yourself, and then I'll start with some questions.
Sorry, I will start. My name is Casey Leva. As Zach said, I am with World Relief. I'm at our national office in Baltimore, Maryland. I oversee our reception and placement program, which is that initial resettlement program for refugees, their first 30-ish to 90 days in the US. And I've been working in this program for over 10 years. So I'm really excited to be able to talk to you all today about the program and answer some of Zach's questions. Go ahead, Taffy.
Thanks, Casey. My name is Taffy Webb. I am also with World Relief. I am our Director of Community Engagement for our U.S. Programs Division, and really focusing on creating pathways of engagement for our volunteers and church partners, as well as other partners in our community, such as employers that hire our clients that we're serving through our services, and other service providers as well. So really excited to be here today and be able to talk a little bit more about engagement with our immigrant clients, as well as refugees specifically, as that's a focus topic for today. So really excited to be here.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. I think sometimes, though, that term is used interchangeably, and yet it shouldn't be. Like, it has a very precise definition. Like, what is a refugee?
So the formal definition for a refugee is a person who is fleeing persecution or fear of persecution due to race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or participation in a particular social group. In the US, refugees are individuals who are processed and approved after fleeing their home, but they're still overseas. Some of the difference in the definition is in other countries,
You're fine.
refugees are what we would call asylum seekers or asylees. So they're going to the country, like in Europe, they're going to their place where they're finding refuge, and they're still being considered refugees there. Whereas in our definition, we would then call them asylum seekers or asylees. But some of that is that for us, asylum seekers or asylees and refugees have to hit those same or meet those same persecution needs. Or
so like the reality is anyone like listening, so refugees, like if someone is, an immigrant that moves, that means they live outside their country of birth. If someone is fleeing, like if they're someone who is fleeing something, it doesn't mean just because you're displaced because of a natural disaster, you're a refugee. Like, remember what Casey shared. It's like the reality is it's persecution or fear of persecution because of like a social group. So sometimes I think we wrongly think like, oh, I used to live in Mozambique. It's like, oh, there was flooding in Mozambique and people had to move to South Africa. And it's like, those are displaced people. They need love and welcome, obviously, but that is not a refugee. A refugee by definition has been persecuted as fear of persecution because of a social group, which is why, I would just share from a church perspective, like why we should, love and care and show compassion very easily as the people of God for people who are fleeing because of persecution, because of, whether it's their religion, whether it's because, their gender, whether it's because of their political group or social group. And so can you explain, like, I know the population of the world is obviously increasing, but like the population of like refugees, even those, that are defined under that precise definition, has like increased a lot in the past 20 years. I know like this isn't like, we're not going to get into all the political underpinnings of this, but like, is there like a reason why, if you have to share with people, like why it's grown so exponentially in the past 20 years?
Yeah, so we've asked the same question to the UN. So the UN High Commissioner for Refugees are the ones who keep these statistics and manage these statistics for the whole world. And we've asked them that. They've said that one of the main reasons that this number has jumped up so much is not that there are more displaced people and more refugees, but that they're actually getting better at counting these people. Unfortunately, initially, all they were ever counting were the people in refugee camps. And those are the easy people to count because they're all there, right in that thing. They have to, they register, they get their benefits. It's all right there. But now they're also counting urban refugees and people that are just mixed in with the cities. They're finding increasingly being able to find ways to be able to count those people as well and to include them in what they're doing. Of course, there are still major events happening across the world that, and we all are, I think, very much aware of Syrians that were fleeing their country for many years, and that is still, that's an issue that's still ongoing. So there's a mix of recent events and UNHCR, the UN being able to better be able to count the number of people that are displaced.
That's really good. I never thought about the fact that like maybe it's not that there's been an increase. It's been that we can count much better. The reality is, and either one of you can share, this wasn't really on the list of questions, but the average refugee, because who wants to throw the number out, the most recent one from the UN, what's the number of refugees in the world today?
It's roughly 80, I believe it's 79.5 million of refugees specifically, not displaced.
Yeah. So 80 million refugees in the world today. And am I right in the fact that like the average journey is to countries that are proximate? You're fleeing to another, country, which is why, there's lots of refugees in Lebanon. There's lots of refugees in, bordering countries in Africa. Like if you're fleeing from Uganda, like you're going, for Somalia. And so most refugees' journeys does not end up in the United States. I think we have this thinking, especially as white Americans, I'll blame it on white American men because I am in that role that like all of a sudden it's like, how are we supposed to do everything? And it's like, we do a very small fraction of a percentage of what refugees are in the world seeking to be resettled. Primarily the countries that are doing the most are countries that are in the developing world right next to it. But everyone's journey is different. I think sometimes, in my own opinion, one of the reasons the church has gotten kind of almost frightened about refugees is what happened in Europe. And so like refugees that go to Europe go through a whole different process of how to be resettled in Europe. And so if you're on the call, just remember every country has their own rules of how this happens. But the way it works in the United States, and I know it's really complex, but it's about 2 years. But would one of you kind of just walk through like lots and lots of refugees? How do you get to be in the line to get to go to the United States? You know, what's that process like? I mean, some of us know what it's like when you get off the plane in the country, but that process starts long before that. Anyone want to kind of give a brief run through of what that looks like for the United States?
Yeah. So it's, of course, I mean, it starts with, the persecution, fleeing their home, going to the camp or the urban area where they register with UNHCR. Most likely, the majority of our refugees are coming through referrals from UNHCR. So I'll focus on that. And UNHCR is first looking at that person or that case, the family, and determining, can they be repatriated? So can they go back to their home? That's their first step. Can they be locally integrated into the community that they fled to? And then the final consideration is, okay, those two options aren't something we can do or aren't something the family can do. So we'll refer them to resettlement. So then they refer them to someone like the US or to Canada or to Australia, Sweden, Germany. There's some of the bigger ones taking those referrals. But for us, for the US, once somebody is referred to the US for resettlement, one of the first things that happens is they have an interview with USCIS. And USCIS determines, after UNHCR has already determined that they think they would fit under our refugee definition, then USCIS does their own determination and whether or not they're going to extend US refugee status to them. So that's the first step. And once they are able to pass that screening, the family starts working with a Department of State funded, we call it Resettlement Support Center. And that is a place that's overseas, so hopefully reasonably near to where refugees are, but not always, because we just only have about 7 of them, I believe, across the world. So they're helping them making connections to them to get medical screenings, to report whatever family members that they might have in the US so that they could be connected to them. They connect them with more security screenings. Through this whole time, the family is getting security screenings. It's just a continuous loop of screenings. Once the medical screenings and a lot of the security screenings are done and that all looks good, then they're referred to a national agency to be able to we call it a share case initially. And then we refer it to a local office, most likely where that person has family, but it could be just where we know that there are other people that speak that language or are from that country. And then the local office will talk to that refugee's family if that is the case and let them know, hey, we're aware of your family's case. They might be coming soon. And that could be still at that point, like I think Zach said at the beginning that it can be 18 months to 2 years. At that point still, it could still be a year before they travel. So we've got the case. It could be a year. It could be a few weeks really, but it could still be a year off. And so they keep doing overseas. They're still doing more security screenings. They might be doing some cultural orientation to learn about the US. Maybe they're learning some basic English words. Those just continuing to go through that process. Then eventually they're referred so they can actually have their flight booked. And that's like 2 weeks probably before they get to travel. And then the local office knows that they have the flight booked, and then they're having to hurry up and set up that housing and do whatever else they need to do to get ready for that family to come. So even though they've known maybe for a year that they might be coming, until they're actually, that they're definitely coming, there's not a whole lot that they can do to set up for that particular family. And at the same time, that family is going to find out that they have a flight, and their family in the US will find out they have a flight. And then next thing you know, they're here.
So all that to say, if you're listening or watching the recording, like it's a common myth that like when people think refugees are like dangerous or how can we welcome refugees, it's like these are victims who are fleeing persecution. They go through a very, 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 very long screening process, and it's a very small percentage of people who even get to go through the screening process, let alone make it through. And anyone that has like personally encountered a refugee and they talk through it, it's like there's lots of background checks. In fact, a lot of people don't make it. And if I'm speaking out of turn, interrupt me and correct me. Either one of you are more of the expert, but I know that many people don't make it because like it's not that they're a risk; it's that they can't prove that they're not a risk. A lot of refugees, as you're fleeing, like you don't have a lot of paperwork and documents, and you can't prove a lot of things that need proved. And so all that to say, like if you ever, are on social media or talking to your one uncle who's always has an opinion on these things, it's like if it ever comes up that it's like, oh my gosh, we have to protect ourselves from refugees. It's like, now be careful. Like our refugee screening process is phenomenal. It's long, it takes a lot of time. It's very, very difficult for refugees to come. And refugees are like not the enemy by any means. They are people who have gone through severe trauma. And the majority of refugees also, speaking just to the global church, because I know there are people from global partners and other mission organizations who watch these calls. Many of you serve refugees. And like Casey shared, the first thing is if refugees can get repatriated, can they return? And that's why the church global needs to love and pour in to refugees, no matter where they are, because many will just become the foundation of resurrecting and redeveloping countries that have been torn apart by war, violence, and genocide. And so for us to like turn a blind eye or ignore it is not what the church should be doing. Like we should be caring for refugees no matter where they are, because the majority will go back and be the foundation. They'll be the next, nurses and teachers and business people back in their countries of origin, because most wish they could go. They wish they could live at home. They wish they didn't have to flee. I mean, I don't know anyone who, no one volunteers to be persecuted, right? I mean, people are fleeing for their lives. And so can you guys share like either one? And I know there's no one story, but there are countries and regions of the world that at least recently, and it's changed, by the way, anyone that's watching this, there's tons of cool like videos you can Google where it's like, we had a lot of refugees from like the now Czech Republic or from Bosnia and things like that. And it's like, it changes and ebbs and flows based on what's happening in the world. But right now in the world, where, like even in the past few years, where have our refugees primarily come from?
So yes, that has changed a lot over the years. Right now, they're primarily coming from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and there's a very large group that are expected to come from Somalia, Syria, and Iraq, but they have not been able to travel these last 4 years under the current administration. Historically, looking back, one of the other largest groups that spanned a lot of time were the Burmese. And before that, Vietnamese and Cambodians were also very large populations that were traveling. I don't have those actual numbers on me, but
you're good. So one final thing, and then we'll get to actually like resettlement here in the country. But final thing that some of you might be interested in the news, this idea of the refugee cap comes up a lot. And it's just one of these things that is said, and I got everyone nods their head like, yeah, but it's like, what is that? People act like there's been a debate about it for years now. But can someone just basically share what the refugee cap is?
Yeah, so there's legislation framing the U.S. refugee program that requires the president to annually set a number that is the maximum number of refugees that will be admitted into the U.S. that year. We call it the Presidential Determination for Refugees. It provides, like I said, the maximum number, but as well as the anticipated regions from which those people would travel. And it's not just drawn up out of nowhere. It's actually based on an annual report to Congress that is written by the Department of State, Homeland Security, and Health and Human Services on groups of interest that are overseas and just the plight of refugees of particular groups. And so they highlight these groups and the programs through which they think they could be served through in the U.S. refugee program. And then from that, the president sets the cap and the regions through that determination. So it's what has been talked about, what we've been hearing about in the news a lot is this 125,000 that Biden had committed to. That is expected to be what he would sign. So it's signed that for the year, it's the fiscal year. So we're expecting he would sign it around October 1st for October through September. And so that would be the maximum that we could serve. The struggle with it this year, and I don't know if other people are hearing this or if this is just my world, but it was 15,000 this year, and 18 the year before. It's been really low. And because Biden had committed to 125,000, there was all of this expectation that it would increase this year. And that was some of the back and forth people may have been hearing between January and I forget now if it was the end of April or May when he finally signed a new one. It was mid-May. And so now it's 62,500 for this year. We've had 3 presidential determinations this year, which is probably a record. 2 15,000s and a 62,500, which is just aspirational, not one we expect to get or to reach or to try to reach because it's so late in the year. But it at least is a statement from the president, from the administration, that they support the program, that they want to put effort, funding, programming, all of this focus on the program so that it can build up to the 125,000 later.
Yeah, and so, the reality is that, this cap has, it's hovered in different areas. Like, it's hovered around 80,000 for a while, 100, 120, all that to say, if you're listening on the call, and I think we'll talk about this later, but I think one of the things everyone can be involved, even if you're not in an area where they resettle refugees as a primary place. I think I say that to say, my guess is that there are refugees in most of your towns. They have there's refugees in my town. They weren't resettled here, but they moved here. And I've had the privilege of getting to know them. And so you probably have refugee neighbors, even if you're not a resettlement, location. But all that to say, one of the things I think we can be involved in as disciples of Jesus is saying, we should be caring for the most vulnerable and raising that cap, that goal, that expectation. We want it to be raised because the more it can be raised and stay there, the more organizations like World Relief can ramp up. And like we said, this is a long process. So, you can't just, the longer a hose is, you can turn on the spigot and it takes a while for it to get to the end. And so it's we need that cap to go up, and we need that cap to stay up so that everything can start going back to how it used to be. Because as they shared, the previous administration had it at an all-time low. But not only was it at an all-time low, we didn't even hit that. We set this goal and they were only coming, it was the lowest it's ever been, and we only did half of it. So it wasn't even like we were hitting the all-time low, we were going even lower. And obviously COVID is something that has made it difficult in the past year as well with travel and things like that. But let's say the faucet is turned on, and we as the church continue to advocate that continues and it continues to grow, and we help. So refugees start coming in. like maybe talk just really specifically about even in North Carolina, kind of what you do, like what are the resettlement agencies? Like, what does that even mean? Like, why can't they come and live in my town because it's the best town in the world? Like, how do they make those determinations? And what do you do kind of on the ground as a refugee resettlement agency when people show up at the airport? That was a lot of questions all in one. So whoever wants to go.
I'll let Casey take the first part on how they determine like where to place, and then
Okay.
how to get engaged.
Awesome. Yes. So a refugee resettlement agency is receiving the case at a weekly meeting and deciding, hey, I have a Congolese family of 8 here. Which city across the US should I put them in? Most often, like I said earlier, they have family or friends here already, and we're placing them near those family or friends. So that's often why the cities that already have refugees just continue to grow and receive more. However, as there are new conflicts and refugee populations in the world, and they're coming through to us, like for instance, if and when the Rohingya Burmese come in from Bangladesh, they may not know people here in the US, and they could probably go anywhere. The first thing we would do is look at where, even though they might not have family there, where other Rohingya people are, and therefore where that language is, because it's a more specific language. And otherwise, if that wasn't an option for some reason, we would try to gather several cases together and put them in a few specific communities. And often when agencies do that, we're talking among all the national agencies, there's 9 of us, and saying, okay, we're going to focus on these cities for these populations so that the community can build and grow and have that type of support and that language support, while also being, we also want to make sure that they're integrated in the community, which is, I think, probably where Taffy can pick up from there.
We're real quick pop quiz. Let's see if we can do it. I mean, World Relief. I mean, then it's probably, is Catholic Charities one of them? Lutheran Social Services. Like, let's see. Do you know all 9 of them?
Those are the affiliates that
Okay.
the nationals essentially. So Catholic Charities is overseen by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops.
Okay.
LSS sites are Lutheran Immigration and Relief Services and Refugee Services.
Okay.
And then there's HIAS. So let's see, that's 3. USCRI, IRC, I'm doing it out of order. EMM, Episcopal Migration Ministries, ECDC, Ethiopian Community Development, something, let's see. And then us.
Okay. So that's just, so if you're on the call, what's so neat about World Relief is like 1 of 9 is pretty like amazing. And this is what they do. So
forgot Church World
Service. Okay. And how many, like, just to talk through a little bit about how this even impacted you guys personally, World Relief used to have, was it 18, how many, because I know you had to shrink because of stuff, but it's like, the reality is World Relief was, World Relief used to be bigger, but because of this, like, this is the impact. And this is why the church, in my opinion, needs to wrap around great organizations like World Relief, because they now have to do all this work, and they were consistently doing it. And then all of a sudden everything was kind of taken away. And so people that loved refugees and wanted to do this, I mean, lost their jobs. I mean, that's what happened. And, now it's like, how do we ramp back up? And it's like, and I think everyone should just do 10 times as much work. No, it's like, how does that happen without great partners and funding? And it's not only funding from the government, but it's also funding from places like churches that help. So anyways,
right.
Just a little pitch for supporting World Relief.
Yeah, thank you. To earlier question that we had 27 sites, and we are now 14 active sites. So we're working on building that.
Yeah. So someone is determined to go to North Carolina, and that's where they're going to resettle them. What happens then?
Yeah, so the office, so on a national level, those numbers are distributed across our sites, again, by that filter of, what populations, language, community resources are available. So once that's determined and the local site is notified of those arrivals, in the meantime, the refugee resettlement agencies are preparing their community partners, and that varies across agencies. World Relief, we're really focused on engaging the church as a partner in that. And so we really focus on equipping churches to create a space of welcome for those newly arriving refugees. And that can look very different depending on the church and the resources and the areas of focus. But we try to focus on three main areas of engagement. And so we focus on volunteering. So RAs are going to be asking for the community to help provide and support those vital services that are being provided. And that could be anything from meeting basic needs for the setup of housing and what's needed for the house items and those basic needs, to providing services that address language barriers, so tutoring in English, tutoring youth as they get used to the educational system here in the US, from employment services, career coaching. So there's lots of different ways to engage in providing those initial services that address really just hard barriers that come into play around culture and language as you adapt to your time in the US at the beginning. And so there's a lot of partnership between churches and volunteers and other service agencies in the community that help provide those services. So you mentioned the airport, that's a great example. So equipping our volunteers to provide welcome. There is nothing like arriving somewhere and from a long journey and just being ushered out into a vehicle and taken somewhere versus being welcomed by a community of people waiting for you. They know your name, they're ready to welcome you and are excited to see you. So that makes a huge difference in creating that welcoming environment for those arriving in the country. So those are some practical, initial ways to help connect with refugees as they arrive.
And if someone's listening and they're near one of the World Relief locations, my guess is it's as simple as probably just reaching out, sending an email and saying hey, I want to be involved. My family wants to be involved. My church wants to be involved. Help us know where there's needs. And I know World Relief enough. I'm with David enough to know you guys do a great job of helping people learn and understand and teach how to best provide welcome. So that's the good first step. Just reach out and ask, right?
Reach out. Courtney will be dropping some links in the chat, so you'll access that. And I think in the follow-up with the recording, we'll also include some of those links and resources for you. But it is as easy as reaching out and connecting with World Relief nationally, and also they can point you to a specific office as well that might be more local for you.
And so the reality is you have these key kind of time frames or chapters in a refugee resettlement's journey. And I don't know these. I just know there's a time where there's a lot of even financial help, and the resettlement agency can really come alongside. But then it kind of gets to the point where, it's obviously less and less. I guess all that to say, that's why churches are so important, because at some point a resettlement agency needs to keep resettling, which means the hand has to be passed off to say, if this refugee family needs help finding a doctor, it's not that the resettlement agency can't keep helping, but hopefully you're helping the refugee family develop roots and strong relationships and connecting to the church, so that the community is wrapping around not just the refugee resettlement agency, but a larger community. Mm-hmm. What are some of those kind of benchmarks? Is it 90, 180, 365, or how does that work?
I wish it was that simple.
Okay.
A number. There are programs, so there are timelines for our different programs. For the resettlement, the initial resettlement period is 90 days, so that's when a lot of those core services are happening, trying to set up those initial pieces around housing and employment and enrolling in school for kids, things like that. But it really varies by family in terms of going from arriving in a country to reaching what we would say stability, which is, being able to pay for your bills and have that sustainability piece, to really integration, which is where the community really steps in and helping really develop those assets that, those individuals are coming in and bringing to the community, in that development phase of really being integrated as part of the community, not as an outsider. And so that's where the community and church steps in. And that's what World Relief really thrives on, is really matching the community with those that we're serving through our services and programs, and seeing those relationships flourish and being able to equip community members, churches specifically, around how to form those cross-cultural relationships and really walk alongside as guides in that mutual learning journey.
And the reality is, anyone who's listening, is that, World Relief has some great tools and kind of curriculum and kind of coaching and workshops to help with this. But at a very basic level, it's like, if you know and love your community, if you know what the bus route is and how to get the bus, how to enroll kids in school, where the hospital is, where, private care physicians are, it's like you naturally are a great partner because you know those things. And if you're a native English speaker, if you don't, you probably have a much easier pathway of finding out the answers than someone who doesn't know English and can't figure it out. What I've learned in my own community, we have a lot of Burmese refugees that live in Logansport, and they were resettled in another area, that Utah, New York, Idaho, and then they moved here for work. But because they didn't have a refugee resettlement agency, they know work, home, where the Asian market is, the supermarket is, and where church is. But they don't know anything else about our community because it's a huge gap. It's if you don't have those relationships and roots, it's so easy to get siloed as a refugee community. And we just celebrated Pentecost. We, among any other, group, the church understands what it means to not care about uniformity and assimilation, but to say we love diversity, but we believe in diversity shoulder to shoulder together, learning from one another, loving one another well. And so I think anyone on the call, we should practically love refugees by coming alongside them and learning how to welcome well and connect them into our communities. Especially because in communities like mine, maybe community like yours, if refugees and immigrants didn't live here, there wouldn't be much of a community left. It's refugees and immigrants many times are helping our communities thrive. Can you talk about that real quick, either one of you? I think one of the things I hear pastors say to me sometimes, or just church folk in general, is we're in this season, especially right now because of COVID and everything, that it's we're trying to take care of, there's enough needs to go around. Do we really need more people who are a burden on the system? And there's this idea that somehow refugees, even there were communities that were debating whether they should, in states, that we should accept them or not, which I think is ludicrous. But can you speak a little bit to the fact that refugees are a blessing, and that we are called to bless people regardless and love them as the church. But the reality is that this idea that they're a burden and they're hurting things is a myth. I don't know if anyone wants to speak to that. Or
there've been a lot of studies on that, and to show that refugees are having a very positive impact on our communities. One of the more recent ones we're sharing some statistics about refugee entrepreneurs, and that they are more likely to be entrepreneurs and to be starting businesses in their communities than your typical American person that's been there a while. So the study was showing that 13% of refugees are entrepreneurs, as compared to just 11.5% of other immigrants and only 9% of native-born Americans. So they're the ones starting the businesses and getting new things going in their communities more often than maybe some of their neighbors, which is, they say that some of that is just because of their resiliency and they've been through so much, and have already kind of developed some of those skills of this is what I need to do to, to make things happen for myself and to move forward. And that makes them very positive influences in our communities and in our spaces of worship, or, wherever we are. They're the ones that are like, hey, you need to pay attention to this. We need to move on this. And they are often the ones who can make it happen. But there's also just the fact that when we're developing programs and services for refugees and other immigrants in our communities, those programs and services are often also benefiting other vulnerable people in our communities. It's not just the refugees and the immigrants that are benefiting from those. Those are job development programs that can be open and replicated for many different types of people. So I think we also sometimes that gets lost, that people think it's, oh, we're focusing just on them, but we're not. These are it tends to be much more holistic and community focused than a lot of times it's led to believe, or maybe led to believe. Do you want to add anything to that, Taffy? Sorry.
Yeah, I think a lot of times it's hard not to focus on like my material needs and my sphere, my network, and what I'm used to in my culture. And I think a lot of times we look at it as a fear or maybe a loss of something. And so we're trying to justify it like, oh, they'll bring, economic development, and refugees will bring, more diversity and these things. And as like believers, I think specifically in the church, I think sometimes that comes to the forefront versus how we're called to love our neighbors. And most of us are like, okay, we'll do that on an interpersonal level. That's the missional work that we do. We love our neighbors. But the systemic injustices and those harmful narratives are really also contributing and at the root of the problem to loving our neighbor. And so that's where that advocacy piece can come in as well to that. So I think sometimes the narrative that we choose to put at the forefront doesn't always align with biblical values around loving our neighbors as well.
So I'm going to ask two more questions, and there's some Q&A, and so feel free, those that are watching this live, if you have other questions, we'll make sure we go through that Q&A and answer them. So from a very high end view, kind of more an advocacy thing, if there's one ask you can make to people who will listen to this at some point, what's kind of a big, not very practical, meet someone, but kind of more of a high end, these are the kind of changes we'd like to see, and maybe here's how you can be involved with advocating and changing, whether it's policy or something like that. Any kind of big high end thing that everyone can be involved in?
Yeah, so some of the larger advocacy pieces that if you're thinking high level, what can I sign on to? What can I support? So there are several organizations that are working, World Relief, Evangelical Immigration Table. There's several organizations working to really push the White House on some of these policies around refugee resettlement. And so obviously one of the latest ones that we've been pushing is the CAP, so that presidential determination. Because in order to rebuild the program here in the US, we really need those numbers to open up, because the way that it's structured is those numbers provide that pipeline and infrastructure build out for the program. And so as we're continuing to advocate, that's a very simple way. There's direct links with information around those advocacy efforts at worldrelief.org/advocacy. You can go there. We'll drop those links as well for you. But that's a very simple way, signing on to those letters that are coming out to really invite our leaders that are in power positions to make those changes to create more welcoming communities and also more welcoming nation.
And I would remind you that this is one of those advocacy pieces when it comes to immigration, in general. it's usually like the legislative branch. This is an executive branch type thing. So this is like advocating towards the executive branch, and even in your state, the governor's office. It's been governors recently who have been the ones that have said like, oh, we don't want refugees, or we do, and things like that. And I remind you that while advocacy sounds really like scary, it's just telling, especially those of you that have stories, it's just telling your story. Like, I know refugees and they make a difference and they're good for our community and we love them and I worship with them. And, it's just tell that story. It's like in my own state, which is, not the most friendly to newcomers. It's like, it's just telling, it's like, we need more refugees. Like, Indiana is a great place for refugees and we want to welcome them and we want to love them. And the reality is they're a blessing. And it makes a difference because too often the faith community is silent, and partially because I think we're scared of the A word, like advocacy is like, this weird thing. And it's like Adam Lipscomb often reminds me, it's just kind of giving, to use like Christian language, just giving your testimony of the blessing that immigrants and refugees have made on your own life. And you could talk to your legislators about it as well. But the reality is most of them will say, well, that's not us. You need to talk to the executive branch. So in a very practical, like just like kind of grassroots in the community, like if you find out that you have, like you're dropping your kid off for school and you see someone and it's like, oh, like they're new to the community, and you find out, they're a refugee from, Burma, or the refugee from, the Congo or wherever, just some practical things that you should be aware of and can help out with. Anything like that you would say? I mean, obviously I know, like, welcome and befriend them and introduce yourself and all that, like, but like anything that just to be aware of that, like, most refugees, like, here are some of the needs that they might have that you could really help connect if necessary.
Yeah, I think we tend to overcomplicate when it's something we're unfamiliar with. But I think we're just realizing, like, we're all human beings, like, trying to survive in this world. And so some of those just basic needs around, like you mentioned earlier, being connected to community can start as simple as you were saying, is breaking down the wall and being welcoming. And this might seem very basic, but a smile gets you a long way, and that's usually an international language to welcome. But taking it a step further and understanding their story. So there are some basic needs that refugees need, but when you meet someone in your neighborhood, they might be in their initial stages, they might be a year in to being in the States. So understanding their story is a great practical way to connect. So asking those questions, but also sharing your story in your life. So there can be that connection, that mutual connection there. That will help you understand a little bit more. Do they have kids? That's going to identify, there's some needs there with education or support there for parenting. And, are they looking to move closer into another community? Are there housing needs? So those are the types of things you'll start to understand once you get to know their story. And then just a very practical thing is, if they're connected to an agency, local agency is reaching out to that agency to get more guidance on how to support refugees within the community. While you might meet one person, there could be actually, 50, 100 more around you that have had that refugee experience or are currently in the middle of the initial part of that experience as well. So those are some practical ways. Connecting with the agency will open up additional ways to engage there, but definitely it's hard to box someone in there as a refugee and what their particular needs are. So every family and individual is a little bit different in their journey. But those are great ways to start to connect, is just hear each other's stories and start to identify as they talk about maybe challenges or barriers that they're encountering currently.
And if you're a church leader or, in a small group, I would just encourage you, like, now is the time to get involved. Like, reach out to, if you have a World Relief office locally, and just kind of find what some of those things are, whether it's, a lot of times refugees need conversational English partners. It's like, who can we just kind of practice with? A lot of times they're children. SLIFE is when you have, limited, like you have stopped or limited formal education. And so because of that, based on them fleeing persecution, it's like they might need some additional tutoring. And so it's like your church can help partner with the resettlement agency and the local schools to make sure refugee families get that. And it's like, there's just like lots of great ways to connect. And like, and there are some that are super, super complicated. So there are people that are on the call that do this well, but then there's other things that it's like, don't act like you can't do it. It's like, you could do it. Like, just reach out to your resettlement agency and say, how can I get involved? This is a way that we can all get involved. So there's some questions. Is it true that all refugees are from a persecuted social group? Adam, you should just pay attention. Yes, that's true. We did that one. Casey did that one. I don't know the answer to this one, though. Brenda asked, is funding for refugee resettlement run through the states or directly to the resettlement agencies or organizations? And will the funding support the restructure of resettlement organizations? That's kind of a twofold. Like, does most of the funding go directly to you, or does it have to go earmark to states, then to you, or how's that work?
It's both.
Okay.
It's a federal program, but also parts of it that are administered by the state. So there is federal funds that go to the 9 national agencies through the Department of State. And then there's also federal funding through Health and Human Services, through their Office of Refugee Resettlement, that goes to both national agencies and the states. And those are for things related to employment, to extended case management, to helping scale for programs. So there's that's all federal funds, but then states often also have funds that they're putting towards the program outside of the federal funding that they're receiving.
And I'll say something, and I'm not employed by World Relief and have nothing to do with resettlement, but this is one of the reasons why the church needs to advocate for these funds, because it's hard when World Relief and other organizations advocate, because it's like, oh, the only reason you're advocating for this is so you can get more funding. This was the issue when the caps were cut. There was a lot of people like, it's like, no, we need other voices that say, no, we need this funding. We need to ramp this back up. We care about refugees. And it's like, we care about refugees. And so you need to fund these organizations. It just can't be the organizations themselves kind of fighting for this, because it's easy for people to like use that. And it's like, no, they need the funding so that they can serve, refugees that come.
Yeah. And the program, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go for it.
I was just to say the program is meant to be a public and private partnership. So while there is all of that federal and possibly some state funding also, the federal government does not intend to fully fund the program. They intend for us to also be working in the communities and raising money locally, or just asking those community members to contribute directly to the refugees to be able to run those programs. So that, I just want to underscore what you're saying is the federal government does not intend, nor do they expect, that the money that they provide is going to fully fund the program. It doesn't.
But we need as much money from them as possible simultaneously.
Yeah, always very helpful. But I think just also to add in is one thing that the government does look at is the community contributions, and that tells them how welcoming a community is. It's not only based on financial, it's based on the advocacy that's happening for maybe systemic barriers within that community, access to services. It's about also looking at the volunteers that are engaging and the relationships being built that promote that welcoming community. The finances are very important because that helps us sustain and enhance those programs as well. But it really is, we're looking at all those different factors. So both the advocacy, the volunteering, and the giving are very important.
Then the final question in the Q&A was, do all of the 9, I know most of them have roots within Christian churches. Are all of them rooted? So no, but the majority do, don't they? Isn't it more than half or something?
Yeah, most do. So it's, there's one that's just a mutual aid organization. So that's CDC, the Ethiopian Community Group. They're, just an ethnic community group, community-based organization. And then USCRI and IRC are both also not faith-based. I feel like I'm missing somebody. And then USCCB, HIAS, the Lutherans, World Relief, Episcopal Migration Ministry, those are all
Church World Services.
Church World Service, yes, are all faith-based organizations.
Well, we are running out of time, but I want to thank everyone. We have links in there, and the reality is World Relief has lots of great resources and videos. I would encourage you, if you haven't already known who World Relief is, to look and see if there's one close in your community. If not, reach out to us. We do a lot of work with World Relief on a regular basis, so we can help connect you to them as well. And like I said, I think too often we delay and think like, oh, well, when that cap raises and there's more, then we'll get involved. So get involved now and help World Relief prepare and build the partnerships they need so that they have trained people who are providing welcome when people come. So do each one of you, if you just had like one thing to share in closing, you just get one thing, anything you want to share, you guys can have at it and take the last couple minutes. Anything you want people to know about refugees or World Relief?
I would say for World Relief, we're in this to see the church be the agent of change within their communities and join in that effort. And so we're passionate about equipping our community members to do that. And so it does start with you individually, and then the community, the systems at large, but also spiritually in that spiritual level as well. So encouraging you guys to engage in welcoming the stranger and seeking out those resources that are available to do that now, because there are current refugees in your community. And then those that still are here are coming and arriving.
Great word. Casey?
I don't know. I almost feel like I shouldn't follow up on that. I should just let that soak it in. But I guess to add on that, the fact that they're there, they're in your community. I know this group doesn't necessarily need to hear this, but something I want to make sure that we are encouraging other people is that they're not scary. They're not coming to take our jobs. They are, as we were discussing earlier, very positive influences in our community, and they're trying to make it start over, make a new life, and we can support them in that, and we can gather around, and it's not a reason to be afraid or to be standoffish. They're, like I think Taffy said earlier, we're all human. So thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you guys so much for being practitioners and serving in this day in and day out. Anyone that gets the chance to teach or preach, use refugee in your sermons. There's lots of refugees in the Bible that fit the definition of refugee, and we should call it so that refugee isn't this weird word. It's a word that we in the faith community should know and love. I mean, we follow a refugee. And so we should definitely invite and welcome. So this will be recorded. I'll make sure I post it so you can share it with others here soon. We'll create a handout that has all of these links that are clickable for everyone. So feel free to use it. And if you have additional questions, we'll connect you to World Relief or Immigrant Connection for answers. Thanks so much for your time. Thanks for attending, those of you that were able to attend live. We'll see you next month. I don't know what the topic is, but I'm sure it's something good. We'll see you next month. Have a good one.